I will take you with me. You might learn something.
About soccer?
Nah, mate. Not about soccer. And for fuck's sake, stop saying soccer!
Both 777 and ACAT appear to be struggling. And what happens to those companies is going to be a big deal in several different countries around the world.
In most European leagues, the season is now over and the champions are crowned, and they include Sturm Graz. Thank you for all the congratulations. A little bit more on that in the last capstone episode of this season. We have 2 more episodes to go on the Assistant Professor of Football until that capstone episode comes out. The light will remain on, soccer-wise, in Scandinavia, where leagues play through the summer. And that reminds me of the wonderful week and a half I spent in Sweden exactly a year ago. If you would like to take that road less traveled with me, check out the episode on Degerfors EF from last May. It's called The Flight of the Bumblebee. And it tells what surely is one of the most unusual, lovely, and countercultural stories that professional football in Europe has to tell at the moment. Some of it live from Sweden. One of my favorite episodes as well. That's a wonderfully soothing story in these modern soccer times, and it is the exact opposite of the mix between soccer detective story and true crime podcast that we have today. We're about to take this story on with British investigative journalist Paul Brown. He and his colleague, Philippe Auclair from France, have piled up on the Norwegian investigative platform Josimar some path-breaking research on the backstory, the money trail, and the flat-out baffling activities of a group called 777 Partners. And if any of you has heard of them, it's likely because you're aware of what's going on at Everton at the moment. No doubt we'll have more on this. The activities of 777 Partners in the insurance and airplanes business would be a story well worth telling in and of itself. But 777, which, by the way, has a number of meanings, look it up, Urban Dictionary and elsewhere, feature here today because they own stakes in prominent football clubs in Brazil, in Belgium, in France, in Italy, and in Germany. That's Hertha Berlin, by the way, from 3 episodes ago. And, as I mentioned, last but not least, Everton of the Premier League, which they are trying to buy right now. And that deal is in the final stages of being considered. And it might go belly up, and that might make the whole scheme go belly up, with plenty of casualties on the way. Paul has been on this story for much longer than the Everton piece hit the fan, even though he is an Everton fan. And what he discovered will, I think, hold your attention very well for what is a slightly longer than usual episode here. So take a breath, use those seconds to please follow this podcast or rate it on the platform that you're listening to, please. It really helps. And buckle up for a wild ride that will take us from Miami to eventually the British Parliament. Here you go. Paul, you're the visiting professor for today, or the visiting detective, depending on how we approach this story. Could you first say a little bit about who you are, what brought you to soccer, and to doing what you do with the game in your work today?
Okay, so I've always been a big fan of the sport. I have a family who have been heavily involved in it in different ways. My father was a journalist for the Press Association for most of his life. I've followed in his footsteps. I moved into freelance reporting. I've also been a national newspaper journalist here in the UK for many years. I guess you could say that I would never had the talent to play the game, so the next best thing was to write about it. So I've done okay there. It's been an interesting journey. I've been able to travel the world, see beautiful teams, see absolutely appallingly bad teams, meet great people, do really interesting interviews, and write stuff that's been quite rewarding. And it's this latest project is the most intense roller coaster I've ever been on. It's thrown up all kinds of fascinating twists and turns and angles. And I've really enjoyed it so far.
Any favorite club of yours? Maybe one that might be affected by what we're about to talk to as well, or not?
Yes, it's kind of ironic that I am actually an Everton fan.
There you go. Yeah.
Obviously, I'm here to talk about a group which has been trying to complete a takeover of Everton for some time and has been the subject of the investigations that I've been doing along with Philippe Auclair and Joshua. That is a complete coincidence. Kind of a happy or unhappy one for me, depending on your point of view. But it has certainly added something to my personal experience here.
I bet. And knowing some Everton fans here as well, this constant purgatory state takes a toll. So respect to you for hanging in there professionally and as a supporter.
Thank you. Appreciated.
All right, let's embark on this one specific story as a deep dive into all kinds of interesting activities in and around football. But before we get to 777 Partners and the story of Josh Wander, we should clarify two terms here briefly. One is multi-club ownership, and that's thrown around quite a bit and increasingly so today. And the other one is an investor in football clubs. Maybe let's first define a little bit, what is multi-club ownership?
Okay, so it's a relatively new phenomenon in the game, and it's thrown up many issues, multi-club ownership. Essentially, it's an investor or group of investors who puts their money into not just one club, but more than one. And usually the thinking behind that is that you would have a pyramid approach to your ownership. So you have the biggest name, the biggest brand club at the top of the pyramid, and various others in different jurisdictions of the world branching out from it below in the pyramid. And you need the one on top, because normally the way this works is that the owner focuses its attention on the most successful, biggest brand that it can, and it tries to use the other clubs in the group as feeder clubs. So the best and brightest talent at those clubs can feed up into the top of the pyramid, and the youth system of the club at the top can send its players to ready-made teams slightly lower down in the pyramid to get their players experience at a higher level. It makes the whole project easier for people like the City Football Group. Some people appear to be doing this quite well, some people less so. It definitely does not really appear to be a money-making exercise for anyone. It's something that is only successful in inverted commas when you take into account the production line of players and the various interconnected deals that clubs can do. It's not something that would attract private equity firms wanting to make a quick buck. Really, it just doesn't. Nobody is making this successful from a financial point of view. But if you're someone with pockets as deep as Manchester City's owners, for instance, you can run something like this, and it has benefits for you because you have ready-made access to clubs all around the world where you can send the brightest talents from your academy to play football, and you have access to the best players being produced at those clubs. So there is a give and take there, a production line that goes in both ways, if you like. The issues with it.
Well, maybe first let me just clarify a point you just made. You're saying that this is not a moneymaker normally.
No. Very few people are invested in football in general, actually, to make money. Most clubs make a loss. It's difficult to run a successful football club and make a profit. But this model in particular doesn't stack up as something that is going to generate big profits for private equity firms. And there are lots of private equity firms currently looking to invest in football. So if you are looking at a model to use as an investor, this would probably not be the one that would generate the most returns for you. That may change in the future, but so far nobody's really been that successful in making that work. It's not really about generating profit.
So it's important to state that multi-club ownership, about which we keep hearing more and more, is not automatically an investment or an investor model, right?
It's a growing trend, but there are still not a great deal of multi-club owners, and in general, they're not making vast profits on this. There are investors in football who do make a profit, and yes, normally they do that either through the sale of players from their club to other clubs, or they are making profits through merchandising and TV rights and other revenue streams that they've invested in along with the club. There are many reasons why people invest in football, but for years and years, trying to make a profit hadn't necessarily been one of the main goals. In America, in particular, football, Premier League football in my country, in the UK, became a popular destination for American investors because they saw these things as trophy assets they could brag about on the golf course with their billionaire buddies, basically, and they weren't necessarily in it to generate large profits. I think some of these private equity firms that have since come into football are in the business of trying to make a profit, but some of them are quite opaque, so it's difficult to be sure. All I'm saying is that if you were an investor who was coming into football purely for reasons of making a quick profit out of your investment, you wouldn't necessarily look at a multi-club model as the way for you to do that, I don't think.
That is helpful to know. And the other question about multi-club ownership that I had is it always and necessarily a pyramid model? American fans of pretty much any sport will be familiar with this. One club in the upper league, another affiliate or farm team in the second league, then one in the third, yada, 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 yada. Does multi-club ownership always work like that? There's one club at the top and then a variety of feeder clubs in other countries, or are there other models as well?
Traditionally, that was always the case. The first few multi-club owners that came along all seemed to be operating on that basis. Over the years, it has changed slightly, and there are now groups in football who you wouldn't necessarily say have a crown jewel at the top of the pyramid. There are some multi-club portfolios where a lot of the clubs you might suggest were kind of on a similar level, and that includes ones that own a Premier League team. But it's quite a complicated picture because some investors own their stake in one team in the model, if you like, with one set of investors, and they might own their stake in another team with a different set of investors. So it's not a clear picture always.
Maybe we should go to Miami first and explain a little bit about what we know about who these people are, and then you roll it out as you discover things. Mr. Wander, Wander, great name. Mr. Wander and Mr. Pasco have shown up in the media most recently, the two CEOs that have had to step back. The location is Miami. Are we missing any other people and places from the face when this project first emerges?
Well, the owners of this company originally are not all there anymore. It's changed ownership a few times. The one, the two people who founded this company and are still there are Wanda and Pasco. Other investors and other people who've held equity have come and gone over the years. So it's been Wanda and Pasco's baby for the last few years, basically. Although it's a relatively new entity itself. It's only been in existence for a few years. Those two are interesting because their background is in finance. They made their money in the structured settlement market, which is a notoriously opaque market for people to operate in the States. I think it's a place where a lot of quite shady deals are done, and these guys made their money investing in annuities and insurance. And one of the things they were very good at was contacting people who had just been given an annuity by the court. So, for instance, if you'd been in an accident and an insurance company had to pay you out several $1 million, but that's paid over the course of your lifetime because of some wrongdoing in the case. In America, you are allowed to sell that annuity, and these guys made their money essentially coming in and swooping up as many of these as possible. Unfortunately, they are accused in various lawsuits of having done this basically to very vulnerable people who either didn't know what they were signing up for or who were coerced into it.
Yeah.
They would buy these annuities for, pennies on the dollar. Some of these people have regretted their decision to do so since. And we started really here because when we looked at this company, they were making claims to be a $10 billion fund, but nobody really seemed to know exactly where that money was coming from.
Okay, when you say we started here, who do you mean, and where are we at in the timeline here? So they're popping up on your horizon, and who is you?
Okay.
You.
Well, to go back to the beginning, I was first contacted about 777 by a very good source of mine in the basketball world, because they had just made an investment in the British Basketball League and bought that league's franchise club, the London Lions. And this source came to me and said, you need to be writing about these guys. No one knows where their money's coming from. I hear a lot of very strange things. And this was possibly 2 years ago, I think, possibly as long as 2 years ago. At the time, I thought, interesting. I would love to have done a deep dive into it back then, but unfortunately, it wasn't really high on my agenda. And frankly, not many people in this country pay a lot of attention to the British Basketball League. It's kind of a niche market, so I didn't have many clients crying out for a story about it.
Yeah.
Then I discovered that an old friend and colleague of mine, Philippe Auclair, who was the correspondent for L'Equipe, covering Arsenal for years when Arsene Wenger was here in London.
Yes, L'Equipe, for those who don't know, famous French sports newspaper.
Yes,
I noticed, focused on sports. Yeah.
Yes. Then I noticed that he was also looking at these guys who, since my first tip off, had started buying football clubs. So we decided to meet. We had a chat about them, and we realized that we had a lot of information from different places and we're coming at this from different angles, and that there probably was a good story in it that we should try and follow up, and that the two of us would make a good team doing that, because we were operating in slightly different markets at the time. And pooling our resources would be a good way to get under the skin of this story. Philippe already had an existing relationship with Josimar and brought me on board and said this is the best place for this story, and I truly believe that it has been.
And they're out of Norway originally, but English speaking, and do important investigative work on football around the globe. Yeah.
Yes, they're very well known in football circles. They've done some really great stuff, to be honest. They may not be a name that has much cut through in the wider world, but people in football know them, and I think a lot of football administrators quite fear at articles from the magazine, because it's really got under the skin of a lot of people.
Okay, links in the show notes. So you and Philippe decide this is the platform, and we'll dive in. We're still about 2 years back.
No, we started this about a year ago. The two of us began collaborating about a year ago. And obviously, I started looking into where this group's money originally came from, which brings me back to the structured settlement part of this, because people were asking, how did this firm go from buying up people's annuities in this sometimes quite shady manner to suddenly diversifying into something as completely different as football and football clubs. So I started with the financial stuff in Miami and the other places that they made their cash, their early cash, and tracked down people who had a story to tell about them. And we very quickly discovered that there were quite a few, they would describe themselves as victims of this company, who all told us similar stories, that they regret having anything to do with them, that they were treated appallingly. Some of them were taking various companies that 777 run to court. A lot of those cases are still active. And we heard some pretty horrendous things. I mean, I contacted the mother of a young woman who claims that one of 777's insurance companies, well, to tell the whole story, she was in a car accident. She suffered brain damage. She was given a big annuity by an insurance company as a result. But because of her injuries, she ended up becoming addicted to painkillers and then moved on to harder drugs, unfortunately. Her claim is that this company working for 777 contacted her out of the blue, made her an offer to sell her annuity, which she didn't agree to immediately. But her case, which went to court, was that these guys essentially kidnapped her and her 3-year-old son, took her to a hotel, supplied her with drugs, and in return, she signed away almost the entirety of her money for very, very little. And the more digging I did into stories like this, the more cases I threw up of people who had a similar story to tell. None of these allegations have yet been proven in court. I have to stress that.
Right. So your sources are interviews with individuals who have dealings with this company, which is already called 777 Partners at the time. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it was. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Most of them, their experience was through a subsidiary called Sutton Park, which has been the biggest profit-making company in the group, and probably still is at the moment, because the group seems to be struggling everywhere else. But that's for later in the piece, I guess. So, I mean, these stories were really quite harrowing. The mother that I just mentioned there was crying down the phone to me telling this story. She's since featured in the Washington Post. the more I looked into that side of the case, the more disturbing things I found.
Yeah. And that source for revenue streams then connects them to soccer. They first look at TV rights, see that there's a lot of money going in there, and then figure out that the best way to get at that revenue stream is to invest in clubs themselves. So can you tell us a little bit about their first forays into buying football clubs and how much intentionality or lack thereof there is with 777?
By his account, they realized that maybe a better or more efficient way of doing this would be to actually own some of the clubs themselves, because obviously TV companies are paying rights money to the clubs. It's not for instance, in this country, the Premier League does the deal, but the money is filtered down to the clubs. So if you own the clubs, you are getting your share of the cash, right? And I guess these guys saw that as a worthwhile thing to invest in. So according to Josh Wander's account, he never wanted to own all of these football clubs. It's something that just kind of happened because they were investing in revenue streams. Again, which seems slightly odd to the outside world. And I think a lot of people in football, as a result, had questions about this group and what they were doing. And the fact that they were making these claims to be a $10 billion company, which, I think raised a few eyebrows, and that they were also claiming that they only invested their own money and nobody else's, when nobody in the group is a billionaire or even close to being a billionaire as far as we can see. And yet they were pumping all of this money into various industries around the world, because it wasn't just football. They started buying aviation companies. They moved into the aviation sphere. So they own.
Don't they own a low-cost airline that's also gone belly up recently?
Yes, they own two. 3 if you count the paper one in Denmark.
Okay.
They own a budget airline in Canada called Flair, which is heavily in debt and making huge losses every month. And they owned Bonza in Australia, which has not been in existence for very long. Bonza slipped into administration only a few weeks ago, leaving all of its staff without pay for a month. They're still waiting to see if they will get paid because its fleet of airlines were repossessed.
Okay.
So the questions were already being asked about why this company, who had done very well in the structured settlement market and were in making money in insurance and reinsurance, suddenly started buying budget airlines, buying planes from Boeing. They made a big order from Boeing, having set up their own aviation firm, and buying football clubs. It didn't make a lot of sense on the face of it.
Yeah.
Agents, owners, journalists all had questions about this, and the more we spoke to, the more questions we got than answers.
Well, which makes me wonder, didn't the clubs in question have questions too? Let's list them here a little chronologically. So they get into European football, and I think Genoa CFC in Italy is the starting point. And then from there, they buy approximately how much in which clubs?
To break down the shareholding is difficult.
Okay, so let's forget the shareholding, just a stake in.
Yes, so they have stakes in Vasco da Gama in Brazil, Red Star in Paris.
So this is Red Star Paris, I should say, the traditional Paris team with a huge past, a wonderful stadium, and kind of on the move upward. I mean, if you're looking to Paris and you're already skeptical of state ownership, modern models of club ownership there, and Qatar and PSG, you're likely to maybe take a trip to Red Star. And this is where now 777 lands, or Set, as they're known in France.
Yes.
Okay.
Sevilla in Spain, but
famous.
that's the smallest of their stakes. Hertha in Berlin in Germany.
Yes, let me pause here briefly too, because we had just 2 episodes ago a little biography of Hertha's recently deceased president Kai Bernstein, and 777 Partners showed up in that episode as well. Not all of your reporting was out at the time when we did that interview, but you can already hear some skepticism from Misha, who we interviewed back then and talked to about what's going on with that investor, Hertha and Standard Liège.
Yes,
Belgium,
that's the last one. And there's a common denominator for all of these clubs, which is the key issue here. They were all desperately struggling financially. They are all distressed assets. This is what this company does. It invests in distressed assets. It's the same with its investment in the British Basketball League and the London Lions, both distressed assets. It's trying to buy Everton, which is essentially also a distressed asset. It's financially in all kinds of trouble. And as a result, this group were able to buy ownership stakes in these clubs for very, very little outlay. The figures quoted at the time that they purchased stakes in these clubs do not often turn out to be very accurate. It only came out, for instance, in a court case in London over the last few months that they actually managed to get Hertha for basically a song. I think the figure was about 16 million, which is absolutely nothing. Genoa again changed hands for virtually nothing. So they've been able to buy their way into football relatively cheaply.
But there's one other common denominator here. These are all either clubs in big cities or relatively big names nationally. So on the surface of things, when I saw that buying spree first, I thought this might work as a kind of revivalist model of bigger clubs with a lot of tradition, right?
So in one way, they've been quite clever with the clubs that they've picked, because yes, they've picked distressed assets, but they've picked clubs in big cities with huge tradition and history behind them, who have incredible fan bases and great potential to improve. So on that basis, they're all investments that you could see one day coming off. But the problem is that requires a lot of money, and they just haven't put in the kind of funding to any of these clubs that I think they would have wanted. The one place where fans seem to be happy with them is Genoa. They've had more success there, certainly on the pitch, than anywhere else. But at the same time, they've been subject to a point penalty and fines for financial irregularities. And they've had to go before a court in Italy admitting that the club is in a financial crisis in order to get a 60% haircut from the taxman. Mm-hmm. So anyone who would regard that as a huge success needs their head examined, frankly. But on paper, if you look at where they've been, they're in big cities around the world, which have access to infrastructure and a fan base that is incredibly important. You're in Paris, London, if you include the basketball team, Rio. Standard Liège is widely regarded as one of the biggest clubs in Belgium.
Yeah, Berlin.
All these things make Berlin exactly. All these things make sense from that point of view, but clearly it's not working.
Where Everton comes in, right? Eventually the club that is making the most global waves because it's the most popular one with the most worldwide reach of all of those. Is Everton last? Because they haven't followed through with that purchase, right? That's the most recent one.
No, they have been trying to buy Everton since September. And okay, the owners and directors test, which we're told in this country was beefed up. shortly before they tried to buy Everton can be complex. It can take time, but it's rare for a takeover to take this long. It's caused a lot of frustration with fans of the club, and I'm sure inside 777 as well. However, it's been clear from the outset that every time the Premier League asks questions of this group, it doesn't get satisfactory answers. In fact, the chief executive of the Premier League, Richard Masters, said so in front of a government, a parliamentary panel recently. One of the biggest issues for 777 was that it couldn't provide audited accounts from its company for the last 2 years. This would be a pretty big red flag for anyone in the investment world, and clearly was for the Premier League.
Yeah.
Months and months into this process, it still can't. And yet nobody's put a stop to the process. The current owner of Everton recently made the surprise decision to extend the sale and purchase agreement that he signed with 777. That runs out at the end of this month, and it's widely expected that will be the death knell to 777's attempt to buy Everton.
Okay.
Because there have been a set of quite stringent conditions attached to Premier League approval for this deal, and there is nobody that we have spoken to, either outside or inside the company, who believes that 777 can meet them.
Farhad Moshiri is the current majority owner of Everton, is obviously desperate to sell. We'll return to your investigation here briefly, but as an Everton fan yourself, if this deal falls through, you said 777 is interested in distressed assets. If this deal falls through, what position is Everton left in?
Everton's position is precarious, but it was already precarious before this takeover saga began. Mm-hmm. And you could argue it's more precarious now because Farhad Moshiri and Everton have been relying on loans from 777 over the last 8 months for working capital and to continue paying the contractor who is building their new stadium. There is currently still a funding gap. It's come down over the last few months, partly because of this loan money. But Everton cannot currently complete their stadium build without some injection of new funding. And the money that 777 have put in is around £193 million. Which seems like quite a lot of money. The whole purchase should really only have cost around 500, and then you're looking at quite a lot more to actually keep the club running and recapitalise it. But if you look at it in pure financial terms like that, they've pumped nearly half the money they would have needed to buy the club into it in loans, which seems a very strange position to take when they are essentially an unsecured lender. Yes. They're at the bottom of the tree for repayment if anything goes wrong. And there is a possibility that Everton could be forced into administration if another buyer does not come along to rescue it. However, we wrote in Josimar as far back as December that there were at least 2 other US-based investors who had expressed an interest in buying the club. One of those has since backed away from making an offer, but there is another one still out there who is very interested in becoming the next owner of Everton. And we've also been told by several sources in the wider football investment world that if the club was to go into administration, it would suddenly become extremely attractive to a wide variety of different US-based investment groups, because administration would help to wipe out some of the debts. Yeah. It would make a much cheaper option for these people to come in on. and possibly be a way out of the problem.
All
The
right.
difficulty, obviously, from the club and the fans' point of view, is that administration means a fire sale of assets. So your best players immediately are sold to pay off the debts. You would be hit with a sporting sanction, which is a 9-point penalty in the Premier League for doing this. And for a club that only narrowly avoided relegation this season, that would be a big deal. So Everton fans would rather that a takeover was completed and we didn't have to go down that route, frankly. But my impression is, from talking to people, that there are currently no stakeholders involved in this process who want to put the club into administration, and that it is more likely that another solution will be found. And I think that's positive news.
Yeah, certainly for Everton fans. We have also implicitly now touched on the different models of ownership or member ownership in the different leagues. Hertha, for those who didn't listen to the Kai Bernstein memorial episode, is of course a club that has to operate under German rules. So 50+1 of some sort is in place. 777 does not own the majority there. English model, especially Premier League, and especially now with a regulator on the way, different. Majority ownership by an individual or group is very much possible. These are not member-owned clubs, and yet the league has the so-called fit and proper test for investors, and this is the one where the hang-up is. Could this now stop the whole 777 project? They were on a roll through various European countries now, and the most difficult quiz or test they faced, I think, seems to be this one at Everton, right?
Absolutely. We were told that before they made the decision to try and buy Everton, there were plenty of dissenting voices inside the company who were warning 777 they shouldn't do this. They couldn't afford it. It would bring too much scrutiny.
They're going to look too close. Yeah.
Yep. And that it would be a bad idea and they should back away from it. For whatever reason, Josh Wander personally decided that he would ignore all of that and do this. It seems to be his personal baby. He's pushed hard for it. But in recent weeks, the house of cards appears to be collapsing because, and where to start on this really. It probably began with a series of ratings downgrades. And what you have to understand is that funding for a lot of 777's ventures recently has come from a Bermuda-based reinsurer called 777 Re. And into this entity were seeded loads of assets held by US insurance companies in groups like SILAC and ACAP. Those assets went into the reinsurer and they have been slowly used to drip feed money into various 777 companies. They've invested in various different projects around the world. Unfortunately for the company, 777 Re in Bermuda was placed into administrative control a few months ago by the regulator there, who had serious concerns about how it was operating. This caused a ratings downgrade for the reinsurer, which meant a lot of these insurance companies pulled their money out, and 777 as a result having much less access to capital. SILAC completely removed all of the seeded assets. That has totally gone from Re, and ACAP has been forced to do the same thing, although it is slowly going through that process at the moment. ACAP has 5 US insurers in different states and is run by a man named Kenneth King. I was on a webinar with him shortly after this all took place, where he had promised to fix the issue and that there was nothing to worry about and that his exposure to 777 Re was all being carefully controlled. Unfortunately, since then, the AM Best credit ratings agency has hit these insurance companies with a big ratings downgrade. So there has been some contagion to the insurers in the US as a result of this too. And the insurers in the ACAP group are now being very carefully looked at by regulators in the US, who have forced them to begin divesting completely from the relationship with 777. That's a problem for 777 because ACAP was the last major source of funding available to the company. And our understanding is that every other attempted capital raise that 777 has tried over the last few months has failed. They brought in a team of advisors and brokers called Tifosi, whose role was to approach as many people in the football world as possible to see if investment could be brought in to the multi-club model. And we have documentation showing that Tifosi approached up to 150 different potential investors, and that they didn't get a single bite from any of them.
Wow. So obviously what this raises now is a liquidity question for all these clubs that 7-7 is in.
Yes.
Is this, to go back a little bit to the beginning of our conversation, is there an actual structure for the multi-club model, or is it just a case that they have a piece of this, a piece of this, a piece of this, a piece of this, but there's no legal structure that ties it together, or is there?
Well, 777 has a football group, a football division, and all of their football investments are run through that. The company involved is called Nutmeg. It's essentially a subsidiary of 777, and it has various branches that come down from Nutmeg into entities which own all of the individual clubs. So there is a structure that goes up to the top of the tree. Unfortunately, Nutmeg ultimately stops with the group of companies which couldn't provide audited accounts to the Premier League purchase of Everton. So all of these clubs are in the same boat.
By the way, for the Americans and continental Europeans who don't know the answer to this, what's a nutmeg in football language?
Oh, right. Yes.
We have a number of great names here.
It's a particular skill that a player, when a player tricks you and puts the ball through your legs, if you're a defender, and beats you off the dribble like that, that's called a nutmeg.
Yeah. In Austria, we call it a gurkel, a cucumber is what it's called in Austrian football terms.
I didn't know. I learn something new every day. It's regarded as a trick, something that's people love
programmatic to call the company that way as well. Yeah,
possibly so.
And tifosi, which you mentioned before, is of course the Italian term for supporters.
Yes.
Hey.
So all of these clubs now have a problem because 777 is clearly undergoing a liquidity crisis. Its access to capital has completely dried up. Its hopes of adding a bright, shiny jewel to the top of its pyramid seem to be fading into the distance. And its one final source of funding, ACAP, has been told to stop investing in it by regulators in the United States and Bermuda. As a result, 777 has had to bring in a firm of restructuring experts, as they are politely termed, called B. Riley. When we asked questions about this company, we were told that they specialized in bankruptcy proceedings rather than the turnaround of companies. So you may draw your own conclusions from that. But the last few weeks have been interesting for the clubs involved in the group because there were existing court cases going through the courts in Belgium with Standard Liège, where 777 were being accused of failing to pay the former owner of the club, and also a group of people connected to the stadium there. Those people won their case, and on paper at least, Standard Liège is no longer being controlled by 777, although that may...
This is a club where Wander and Pasco were on the board. Sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
Weren't they in some official function there as well? Not just as an investor, but personally?
Yes, they appear on the boards of several of these clubs, yes, and have been forced to resign from some of them. For instance, The club they own in Brazil, Vasco, went through a similar process. Their ownership there was challenged in the courts, and the club essentially were granted an injunction which removed 777's ownership of Vasco. That is being challenged by the company. It lost the first round of its legal challenge, I think yesterday, actually, in the Brazilian courts. And essentially in US parlance, I suppose that is going to appeal. But the wider issue is that 777 no longer seem to be in control of their own operations. Wanda and Pascoe announced to their own people that they were stepping down from the board of 777 itself, and that B. Riley were now in charge and running the show. And the big
who are B. Riley? I don't think we've.
They are the restructuring experts that I mentioned. They are that's what they do basically. But the big development in all of this was that one of 777's biggest lenders, a UK firm called Leadenhall, recently brought a very explosive case against them, which has been picked up basically by everyone, accusing them of massive fraud and of double pledging assets, some of which Leadenhall believes do not actually exist. 777 obviously refute those allegations and are fighting that lawsuit in court, but it was incredibly detailed, and it outlined weeks and weeks of telephone conversations between members of Leadenhall and Josh Wanda, which were recorded with Wanda's own permission, where he admits in several places that he basically has no money left. At exactly the same time that 777 were briefing the media that their £500 million plus takeover of Everton was going to complete by the end of the month, at exactly the same moment, Josh Wanda was admitting to Leadenhall that he couldn't pay them £15 million that he owed them. Yeah. That would be impossible. So, again, these allegations have not been proven in court.
How did they make the loan to Everton then?
Recent loans to Everton have been made entirely through ACAP.
Okay.
We have documentary evidence to prove this. Both sides would probably deny it if it was put on them publicly. And I think because ACAP has essentially been told by regulators in the United States that it cannot invest in anything related to 777 anymore.
Yeah.
That these current loans may form part of another legal case, which is going to be hugely complicated and very messy for all concerned.
Wow.
So that's where we are in a nutshell right now.
Just what you dreamed of when you went to your first Everton game, right?
Yes. I had no idea I would ever be writing anything like this, or that the club I supported would get involved with anything quite so messy or difficult to understand. But my takeaway from all of this is that whatever happens to 777 and the football clubs, this is a much bigger story than football. There is the potential for contagion in so many other industries around the world. And there is the potential for class action lawsuits being brought by US insurance policyholders who are going to ask at some point where their money has gone, because both 777 and ACAP appear to be struggling. And what happens to those companies is going to be a big deal in several different countries around the world.
what is the potential for contagion, but also potential for lessons learned from this to football, to fans of other clubs who might be listening to this now and say, phew, glad this is not my club, but the next Josh Wonder might be around the corner at their clubhouse too.
I think football fans and the football authorities need to be asking many, many, many more questions of the kind of people who are trying to invest in this sport, because they are not doing so at the moment. The people who regulate football around the world are failing in their duty of care to these clubs. Some of these people investing in football do not care about football. They don't have the faintest idea how football works, either on the pitch or in the boardroom or financially.
Do you have any evidence, by the way, that Wander and Pascoe know anything about the game?
Neither of them have ever been fans of football.
There you go.
Wander is a basketball fan. He's followed the Miami Heat for years in the NBA. He's pictured at various after parties, hobnobbing with some of the stars of the Heat after championship wins. That's a whole other story. Yeah. He's never expressed any interest or fandom in soccer at all. Again, strange for someone who's pumped so much money into it, which he claims is all his own. But I come back to this issue. There are a lot of people investing in football now who do not, on the face of it, appear to be the right people to own clubs which are a massive and important part of their communities and should be in the hands of someone who understands that. Multi-club ownership is a wider problem because there's scope for all kinds of other issues around this too. Some of these clubs compete in the same competitions. How can, for instance, one team owned by, let's, as an example, say that the City Group play against another team owned by the City Group in Champions League or in a European competition without that being a conflict of interest? Currently, UEFA, which runs European football, says, no, it's all fine and we have no issues with the multi-club model. There's going to be more and more of this coming into football. And okay, football is desperate for investment. Mm-hmm. Football clubs are desperate for investors to come in. A lot of these clubs are in trouble. That's why investors see a quick and an easy way into the game. But we are allowing people into our sports, and in my country it's known as the beautiful game, who are in danger of corrupting it and ruining it. Mm-hmm. And I think it's about time people started asking a lot more questions of them. Yes. 777 is just one example, probably the biggest and most important one right now. But there are other groups who are doing the same kinds of things as 777 already operating in football. And people need to understand that I don't think fans of many clubs even know the ultimate source of most of the money that goes into their club. And that cannot be a good thing for the game. There is all kinds of scope for abuse when you own more than one club in more than one jurisdiction, which could then compete in the same competition. It's in my opinion, it is a bad thing for football.
And the clearest evidence of that is that we already had an instance like the one you outlined, and it's Red Bull, which, for lack of a better word, owns, and that's not their explanation for it, owns a club in Leipzig, German Bundesliga, club in Salzburg, Austrian Bundesliga, and both of them have competed in the same European tournaments before, and the way they've solved it is to restructure this as kind of a sponsorship model and comply with rules at the end of the day that UEFA did not object to. And Austria and Germany are two countries where 50+1 is a model. So it's possible to do this kind of thing and pull it off and send two clubs in the same tournament in Austria and in Germany. And if it's possible there, then, or at least it's possible in Germany, everything goes, maybe in other countries. So your call for a closer look, a tighter process, I think is more than warranted.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think that leagues around the world, certainly in Europe, are currently fit for purpose on this. the owners and directors test in the Premier League is not worth the paper it's written on, because as of today, there is nothing that someone in the Premier League could point to in their rule book which would rule 777 out as a potential owner, even though it has had court cases against them. Under its ownership, one of its airlines is going bust. Its co-founder has pleaded no contest to a felony charge of drug trafficking.
No, and he admittedly has no money.
Indeed. And yet the Premier League is for some reason unwilling to turn around and say no. And part of the reason for that is because these rules have been written so badly that there is nothing legally watertight that the Premier League could point to today and say that rules you out of being the owner of a Premier League football team. And I find that frankly ridiculous.
Are you hopeful the proposed regulator, which we talked about here 4 weeks ago, I think, is going to be an improvement?
Well, we've just had a general election called in this country, which means that the bill that was being brought in for that regulator will be now shelved until a new parliament. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Whoever wins the election has expressed a desire to do this, so it will probably be on the statute book at some point. And having looked at it, it's very interesting that on paper, at least, some of the questions that would be asked of new owners appear much more forthright. There is, there's some good stuff in there about money laundering and, various other criminality that the current rules do not really address in enough detail, I don't think. But the big question mark, I think, for some with the regulator as it was put to us before this election was called, was that it would give the government power to have a say on state ownership of clubs, and that the government should be allowed to weigh up the pros and cons, essentially, of the politics behind that, as well as just whether they thought these people would be good or suitable owners for a football club. Right now, and the government may apply pressure. I'm sure it did apply pressure in the case of Newcastle and the Saudis, for instance. But right now, there is nothing in the Premier League rulebook which says that it must consider the wider political implications of saying no to a state trying to own a football club. And I think the fear in this country, and it's a fear based on fact, is that if a bill like that does go through and a regulator does come in where a government is able to weigh up the politics of something like that, that it may encourage more state ownership than less. And along with the multi-club model, states owning football clubs is, I would say, as big a problem for football right now, because it distorts the market and it brings in a whole wider spectrum of issues when you consider the politics of that. Yeah. Because, the Saudis have been accused of sports washing.
Of course, yes. Yeah. But that's a Newcastle, but obviously City Football Group, virtually state-owned as well. And then there's PSG with Qatar.
So I guess the bottom line is, no, I don't have any faith that a new regulator would make much difference. And I'm also a little wary of allowing governments to interfere too much in this. I think there is a case to be made that bodies like the Premier League should be allowed their independence to prosecute this kind of stuff better. But currently, they are not doing a good enough job of it, and that's why they are under pressure from the regulator. I think people need to understand in the case of 777 that this is all playing out against the backdrop of the government trying to bring a regulator in.
Yeah.
And the Premier League is in quite a difficult position. It knows that there are lots of questions about this group. It doesn't seem to have the power or the courage, perhaps, to say an outright no to them. But it also knows that if it passes these people as fit and proper and gives them the all clear in their owners and directors test, and it goes wrong for whatever reason, which it certainly does seem to be on the verge of doing, that a new regulator would have an absolute field day with that fact. And it seems to me that the Premier League has been essentially hedging its bets on that basis for the last few months, unwilling to say no, but at the same time briefing that it's for the owner of the club to walk away rather than the Premier League to come to a verdict on this. Whilst at the same time also probably being quite concerned that if they were to say no, that 777 might try to sue them for some reason. So that the whole thing is an almighty mess. And I don't think that a government regulator would be the perfect answer.
Not a magical solution to what really is a structural problem.
It might make a difference, but there are wider issues going on here. And I doubt that a government regulator would have the necessary powers to make much of a difference here.
Part of what you're saying has me think nothing to be done here from a footballing perspective. This is one of the symptoms of late stage modern capitalism, and here is one of the stages where this plays out. Is that too negative? Do you think there is something that football structures, football fans can do to make for a better future?
Football could certainly legislate against this kind of stuff, but I don't see the appetite for doing so, and that I think is a shame. The last really big issue that the football world had was around the ownership of players, because investment groups were coming in and buying up stakes in players and then moving them around the world to different clubs, skimming off the profits on each deal. They would buy their way into certain clubs, and then you had access to both the player and the clubs. You could move a player that you owned from a club that you owned to a club that you owned, which I don't need to tell you was rife for all kinds of wrongdoing. And football eventually did get its act together and outlaw that. There is no reason why football could not turn around tomorrow and outlaw both the multi-club ownership model and the ownership of clubs by nation states. But does anybody really believe that there is an appetite to do that when these are the two groups of people who are currently investing the most money in football? I don't have any faith that either FIFA, UEFA, or anyone else is going to do that. And I think it's a shame. I think it's an appalling state of affairs.
What we can do is support independent journalists like you in the work of shining a light on what is happening across the globe. And if you're not an Everton fan, it could be your club tomorrow. And if you're not a Hertha Berlin fan, even in Germany, which sometimes thinks it's safe because of 50+1, it could be your club tomorrow too.
But I would add to that as well.
Yes,
it's not just fans of clubs that you. It's not just that it could be your club tomorrow. It could be your insurance policy tomorrow.
Yes.
You are a retiree or an orphan or a widow. Your insurance money could suddenly be invested in a loss-making, debt-ridden football club on the other side of the world via an offshore reinsurance company. This is going to become a financial story and a much wider story than football, especially in the United States. And if I was an insurance policy holder with some of these companies, I would be worried about my cash and where it is, where it's been invested. I would want answers. I would want to know exactly what that company has done with my money and whether I'm ever going to get it back.
Well, let's hope there are more investigative journalists of your ilk around the world that are following up on these stories as well. As a matter of fact, I think this is beginning to get traction in the US media, isn't it?
It is. The New York Times and the Washington Post took this up quite some time ago, but I think it's now an issue that the wider media in the insurance industries in the States are well aware of and looking at very closely. And I think it's only a matter of time before this becomes such a big issue that it's on TV stations and makes headlines in big newspapers across the country, basically. We'll see.
Summer is upon us, and various journalists keep digging. First and foremost, you and your colleagues. Is there anything that you're working on right now that you're able to tell us about? And what do you see the future of the Everton case, the more immediate future, to look like?
We're working on quite a few things. I can't really share what they are yet. Some of them are legally difficult to publish, but we've encountered those problems before and managed to get around them. So we will see, but we have certainly not finished yet. And I personally believe that Everton's future will be much clearer in the next week or so, because the sale and purchase agreement with 777 runs out at the end of this month.
Right.
And at that point, we will know, I think, what the owner is going to try and do. He has options open to him, but we don't yet know which way he's going to jump. So he could either sell to a new bidder, he could try to stay on and carry on funding the club himself, or some kind of haircut could be found for the creditors, either via administration or via another route. So I think in Everton's case, at least, there will be news in the next week or so. We also are told that the clubs in the 777 portfolio already are currently all for sale. ACAP appears at least to be trying to foreclose on any assets that it can in the 777 group, and 777 is being forced to sell anything it can to keep going. So there are talks going on, certainly, to sell Standard and Vasco, and it would not be at all a surprise to see similar talks happening with the other clubs. So their futures may also become clearer in the next few weeks as well, I think.
Yeah. And I will point to some important work on a similar but unrelated issue that your colleague that you mentioned at the beginning, Philippe Auclair, has done. The research that is up on Josimar regarding betting companies and the involvement of particularly Asian betting companies in English football is significant as well, and something that especially fans of the game globally should take a look at too. And I will link to that as well.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. Anything we didn't? Well, I'm sure the answer to that is yes, right? There's 1,000 dimensions to this that we probably didn't cover, but anything basic that you think people would still need to round out the story as we've discussed it today?
I think it's going to take some time for it to unwind. I mean, we covered all of the major points. One thing that I didn't mention was that there's been quite a significant brain drain, if I can call it that, from 777. It has lost a great deal of its major executives over the past few months. Many of them have not been replaced. It is a much smaller company than it ever was before, and we are told that there are only a very small bunch of long-term Josh Wander loyalists left there, some of whom went to college with him. None of this, again, bodes well for the company. What happens and how they get out of this, if they can get out of this, is the big question. But I think it's a case of watch this space, really, on that.
That's right. Watch this space, especially watch uzimarfootball.com. Link is in the show notes, and the work of you and of Philippe Auclair there. Thank you so much for unfolding what is a sobering story to us, and of plainly putting out the warning and investing the time to bring all this to light. Thank you, Paul.
My pleasure. Thanks for your time.
Be well, despite it all.
I'll try.
So one more regular episode this season on the Assistant Professor of football. And if all goes well, it'll be on a club from a not well-known league at all. That much I can tell you. So this might be a little bit of a surprise, but I think could be a fun way to end the year, especially for me. And then there's the wrap-up episode that we did last year as well, where we ask various guests from over the last year that we have all shared time with, how they're doing now, how their club has done, and what the future might hold. So you can look forward to hear back from St. Pauli, got promoted, and our social workers there. From Graz, of course, where both of these teams won the title, from FC Bayern, from Poland, from Israel, as well as from Switzerland most recently. So a melange of guests who we've had the pleasure of listening to and hearing their stories this year. We'll check in again. And then it's summertime for sure. Be well, and I look forward to you joining again 2 weeks from now.